Hi there, you're tuned, or perhaps you've accidentally stumbled across the LitFest channel here on Emirates. So what's the LitFest channel? Well, every year there's a literary festival in Dubai, usually in February, which is sponsored by Emirates. This means that authors from all over the world can fly to Dubai on Emirates to enjoy the brilliant hospitality, the almost perfect weather, and the opportunity to discuss their books with an adoring audience. As a byproduct of the sponsorship, I get to interview some of the authors to discuss their latest literary works and feature the interviews on ICE. Neat, huh? Our next guest has flown in all the way from British Columbia in Canada. She's Esi Edugyan, and she's joining me here in the studio to discuss our latest novel, shortlisted in 2018 for the prestigious Man Booker Literary Prize, Washington Black. Esi, welcome to Emirates, welcome to Dubai, your first visit to Dubai and to the LitFest. I know you've only been here a couple of days, but first impressions?
It's all very, so different from anywhere I've ever been, and it's very, there's a glamour to it, but it's also so fascinating because you do see how you are very much kind of in the heart of the desert, so it's, yeah, very, very different.
Have you been out into the desert?
I was there yesterday.
Oh, really?
Yes. Rode a camel and had dinner under the, yeah, it was just gorgeous. Really beautiful experience. It's very quiet out in the desert. You don't expect that kind of calm. So there were over 100 people, but you didn't have that feeling. It felt very solitary.
And a long flight. You flew in from Vancouver, right?
Vancouver Island.
Vancouver Island, on Emirates?
On Emirates.
That's a long way. You must be feeling pretty jet lagged right now.
I am a little jet lagged, but it was a very comfortable flight. So.
Good. Now we're here to talk about your third book, I believe, called Washington Black. You've got a copy, I've got a copy. Tell us about the book and how it came about.
Yeah, so Washington Black is the story of an 11 or 12-year-old field slave called George Washington Black. And he was born and raised on a plantation in Barbados, so he's known no other way of life, but one of great savagery and brutality. And so he's totally shocked to one day find himself taken to live in the quarters of his new master's brother, who's a man called Christopher Wilde. And Wilde is totally unlike every white man that he's ever met until that moment, which surprises him and relieves him greatly. Wilde is a gentleman scientist, so he's a naturalist, he's an inventor, he's an explorer, but he's also an abolitionist. And it's through his taking Washington out of the field and teaching him how to read and how to draw that Washington starts to kind of come into his own as a person.
And what time is it set? What year is it set?
It's set in the 1830s. It covers a span of 6 years. So we follow him from about the age of 12 until the age of maturity, in a sense. He's 18.
And as far as locations go, you get everywhere, don't you? Yeah. You go up to Hudson Bay, you go to Harlem, you've had great fun doing that, I can see.
I did, yeah. So the book starts in Barbados, but it doesn't stay there. And we travel through so many different climates and cultures. We're in Virginia in the United States, we're in Canada in the far north, we're in Nova Scotia, England, Morocco. So it's really a book that moves quite a bit.
So when did the idea come into your head? When did the idea for Washington Black first materialize?
Yeah, so several years ago I came across the story of a man called Andrew Bogle, who was an ex-slave who had been the main witness for the defense in what was one of the Tichborne claimant trials, which, for those who don't know what those were, it was like a very long, circuitous series of trials in that ran from the 1860s right into the 1890s in England, and they centered around the disappearance of a man called Roger Tichborne, who was the heir to all of the fortunes of his aristocratic family. And he ended up dying or being shipwrecked off the coast of Brazil, but his mother refused to believe he was dead, and she hired a clairvoyant who told her that her son was alive and well and living in a far-off land, and she just needed to find him. So she put newspapers in, she put letters in newspapers all around the world and came up with a reply from Australia from a man claiming to be her son who'd been living as a butcher there for the last 4 years. And she immediately believed it was him. She wanted to believe it was him. But just in case her family at large, wasn't going to buy this, she managed to reach out to Andrew Bogle, who had retired. He'd been in the family's employ for 40 years and then had retired to Australia. And so she reached out to him to go and make the identification of her son. And the reason that he was entangled with the family is because he had been the valet of Sir Edward Tichborne for over 50 years. And Edward had stolen him off a plantation in the Caribbean and brought him to live in England. And so I thought I would tell the whole crazy, bizarre story of the trials through the eyes of Andrew Bogle. But when I started to write, the material started to shift and stray, and I realized that I was much less interested in all of the intricate details of those trials than in the life and the psychology of somebody like Andrew Bogle, who was taken from a plantation life as a slave and brought to live in European societies that he could never have conceived of at all, and during his time on the plantation. So I thought, okay, that shift in his idea of himself in the world, to go from having a very dire and prescribed idea of what his life could be to entering a completely different world, I thought, okay, that's my subject matter.
That's the most extraordinary story I've ever heard. And I've literally never come across that before. Where on earth did you unearth it from?
I had read a glancing reference to it. There's a short story by Jorge Luis Borges, which is a little bit about this history. It kind of touches upon it. And I thought Borges had made the whole thing up just because it was so
It's so
crazy.
fantastical, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's
so
crazy.
fantastical.
Oh, God.
And then I was reading a history of some totally unrelated subject, and there was a footnote about this trial, and then I looked more deeply into it and was reading about Andrew Bogle's role in it, and I just thought that's too good not to write about.
And off you went.
And off I went.
Did you manage to do a lot of research? Did you visit all the locations that the book is set in?
Yeah, I didn't visit all of the locations. Some of them I'd already been to, but it was a lot of research, a lot of looking into what these cities, and in the case of the Arctic, climates would have been like during this time, and how would it have been possible for them to move through these spaces? I mean, this was something that I did so much research on, and also plantation life in Barbados. There's quite a bit on the historical record about that. Hot air ballooning in the 1830s. How people went about categorizing marine life. Like, these are all things that were very deeply researched, and it was a pleasure.
And you were rewarded with lots of prizes and nominations. You were shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2018. You were the winner of the Scotiabank Giller Prize, a finalist for the 2018 Carnegie Medal, finalist for the Rogers Writers Trust Prize. That must have been very rewarding after all your efforts in creating this book.
It was, and it was a book that I started writing when I was, I had just had my son, so I had this tiny little infant who I was caring for as I was writing, and I think when you're in that mindset, you sort of feel very closed off from the world, and so I didn't have a sense that this was something that would be, I guess, maybe appealing to anybody outside my little sphere. So it was very, very gratifying and a relief.
And you've had some fantastic comments from critics too.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Really good. What about your other two books? Let's talk about those. I know this is your latest book, but you've had two other books, one of which was called The Second Life of Samuel Tyne, and then there was Half-Blood Blues. Tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, so The Second Life of Samuel Tyne was written, I guess it's been almost 20 years since the time I started writing it, but it was my first novel. It was very much me finding my footing as a writer, and so it was set in in and around Calgary, Alberta, and Edmonton, Alberta, which is, I was born in Calgary, Alberta, so it was really like almost like a foundational book for me. It was me digging into the history of Alberta, but also my family history. But it feels from this vantage that it really feels very removed from me. Like, I don't feel that that's a book that I would write now. But I feel like it was really probing a story that I certainly hadn't grown up with, which was the history of black townships that had emerged in the prairies at the turn of the 20th century. So freed slaves came up from Oklahoma because at that time the Canadian government was trying to populate the western part of the country. And so they invited farmers from the United States to come up and they offered them very inexpensive land if they would farm it. And so a lot of these emancipated slaves came up, and this was not the kind of farmer, I think, that the Canadian government was expecting. So that was really interesting to me because, I'd grown up in this space and this landscape, but, to see photos of, black farmers tilling the land, and this was eye-opening to know that there was a really deep black history rooted in that space. And then Half-Blood Blues is a completely different novel. Every novel has been, put 7 years between each novel, which I think accounts for why they're so different from each other. So Half-Blood Blues is a story about jazz musicians between the wars, living in Germany and France. And so they played during the Weimar era. They were very well respected. And at that time, a lot of American musicians were moving from the States to Europe because they were appreciated in Europe, and they didn't have to deal with Jim Crow laws that prohibited them from actually engaging with their art and feeling fully free. So a lot of them moved to, when we think of France, we think of Josephine Baker. But some of them moved to Germany as well and had quite good careers there until the coming of the Third Reich. So I was very interested in just exploring this idea of going from this place of total freedom to a place where people's rights are being cut off, and also to know what happened to. This is a very elaborate sort of story that I have to tell, or piece of history that I have to go back into, but after the First World War, as part of reparations that Germany had to make to France, was they had to cede part of the Rhineland to France, and this was quite an upsetting thing, but so the French, instead of using domestic soldiers to police that border, they called up soldiers from African colonies.
Really?
They did, yes.
Gosh, never knew that.
Yeah, so for the very first time, there were people, and these were soldiers from places like the Sudan, and so it was a very distinctive kind of a look, and it was the first time, I think, that a lot of people had seen a black person. And so I think for some of the German populace, this was a very upsetting thing. There was the feeling that this was done deliberately as a kind of race contamination. And in some cases, there were German women who had children with some of these soldiers. And these children were dubbed the Rhineland bastards, was the term for them. And at some point there was some discussion about legislation to, should they remove these children from their mothers? Should they sterilize them? In some cases they did. So there was a whole discussion about them once the Third Reich was ushered in. But I sort of wondered what happened, what did happen to a lot of these children and what did their fates look like? And so that's also a question that gets investigated in Half-Blood Blues, because one of the musicians is a Rhineland bastard. And so it's really looking at his fate and also what happened to him during the war. I think a lot of the band members, they simply don't know. And so that's something that they're discovering throughout the course of this novel, which spans like 50 years.
Esi, you have the most remarkable talent for digging up incredible stories.
Oh, thank you.
So on the basis of your work output to date, I guess your next novel will be around about 2025?
I hope not.
Are you working on anything now?
Having said that, no, I haven't actively started. I'm in the research stages of doing my next book. I'm somebody who, it takes me a long time to settle on exactly what it is I'd like to write, so I have 2 ideas that I'm researching right now, and I'll just at some point have to choose one.
And in between time, you're traveling the world promoting your latest book, Washington Black.
Yes.
It's been a real pleasure talking to you. It's been an eye-opener for me too, so thank you very, very much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your time here in Dubai.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.